Okay, welcome back. So today we're looking at May-June 2019 question paper 12. So just like the other ones, we're going to go through the questions that are duplicated from question paper 11, and we'll just circle the correct answer. You can go to that video for the full explanations. So there's 9 questions in total that are duplicated. Okay, we'll start from question 29. So what is the most likely disadvantage of international specialization? Okay, decreased levels of output. That is not likely to happen. So if we specialize, international specialization is where we're focusing on what we are best at making, and another country will focus on what they are best at making. So the levels of global output should rise as we'll be able to make more of whatever we're good at, and another country will be able to make more of whatever they're good at, and then we're going to trade. So we'll trade our excess on what we're good at making to import something that another country is good at making, but maybe we are bad at making. So through trade, the levels of global output should actually increase. It will not result in average costs going up, it will result in average costs coming down, because we're only focusing on making the products we're good at. So we're going to have, or we should have, good economies of scale with those products. It will result in increased productivity levels, okay, but that is an advantage. That is not a disadvantage of international specialization. So the correct answer here is D, over-dependence on other economies. And what do we mean by this? If we are specializing, say for example, China specializes in rice, and Thailand specializes in potatoes. If we're only making rice and we're not making potatoes, we're going to have to rely on Thailand making the potatoes in order for us to be able to import the potatoes into our country. So we have a dependence on other economies trading with us. Okay, and if that trade is affected, then that is going to affect how many products we can bring into our own country. Right? So even though it does increase global levels of output, it will be affected by the ability to trade between countries. Okay, world demand for oil. This is a difficult question, right? The world demand for oil is price inelastic, and oil is paid for in US dollars. If the price of oil falls rapidly, how might this affect the exchange rate of the dollar? Okay, so the first thing is we just need to identify what will happen to demand first, right? So when it's price inelastic, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a proportionate fall in price, right? But that proportionate fall in price is going to be larger than the percentage change. Than the percentage change in the quantity demanded, right? Now normally with a normal demand and supply diagram, you'd say that would mean that the demand would have to come down, right? But the demand and supply, when we're talking about the exchange rates here, is the full effect, right? So if the fall in price is larger than the percentage increase change in demand, that's still going to result in our total revenue coming down for the oil, right? So that means that therefore, because our total revenue will come down, inelastic, price down, revenue down, that means that our demand for, in this case, US dollars will fall. And when the demand for US dollars fall, we're going to see that that will result in an appreciation, or depreciation, sorry. Okay, so less demand for US dollars and the value falls. And if we draw a simple demand and supply diagram to show that, demand will shift left, there'll be less demand, and we can see that the price will come down, which will cause a depreciation. Price down, depreciation. Price up, appreciation. Okay, 24. What usually happens as a developing country becomes more developed? So what happens as they become richer? Now, if we start at the bottom, the primary sector expands. That's wrong. So what's going to happen is that as they become more developed, they're more likely to move from the primary sector to the secondary or the tertiary sector, where productivity is higher. Therefore, it'll help them to increase their GDP. The infant mortality rate increases. That's also wrong. The infant mortality rate should come down as people will get access to better healthcare, etc. The fertility rate declines, so that's going to be correct. Because what happens is we start to have less children. Okay, and that's what the fertility rate is relating to. So when our economy becomes more developed, people will have less children, the birth rate will fall, and the death rate will fall when we get access to better healthcare. People are going to be focusing on their careers instead of having children. And the average age of the population doesn't fall. The average age of the population should go up, because we just explained that the death rate will go down, which means that people will be living for longer. '23. Okay, the rate of inflation changed from 3% to 2%. In March 2016, the rate of inflation was 4%. What happened to the price level in January and March? Okay, so very simple. Price level in all of these figures is plus, right? Which means that in every month here we had inflation. So they're trying to trick you out here. But if we have inflation, if the figure is a plus, then that means that in each one of these months, it has become more expensive to buy goods and services, which means that in January and March, they would both have risen. So in March, for example, here, it's 4% more expensive to buy goods and services than it was in January when it was 2%. But January means it's still 2% higher than it was in the previous month. So they're both going up, they're both making goods and services more expensive. Okay, 22. What describes frictional unemployment? So remember, frictional unemployment is made up of seasonal and temporal unemployment, right? And the key thing about frictional unemployment is that it is a short-term form of unemployment. People will only be out of a job for a short period of time in comparison to structural and cyclical, which are long-term forms of unemployment. Okay, so unemployment caused by a general fall in economic activity, that is not frictional, that is cyclical. Remember, cyclical unemployment is long-term, and that arises, or it comes about, because of a lack of aggregate demand. Unemployment caused by the time of the year, so that would be seasonal, right? But that is a form of frictional unemployment. It is not frictional unemployment itself, it's like a subsection. Just like regional and technological are types of seasonal unemployment, or types of structural unemployment. Unemployment caused by wages being too high, again, that's not going to be frictional, but frictional will be workers searching for jobs, which is just likely to be our temporal unemployment there, or temporary unemployment, a short-term form of unemployment where eventually they'll find a new job. Sometimes we also call this search unemployment. Okay, they're searching for a new job, and when they get a new job, then they're going to take it. It's nothing to do with their skills being affected or a lack of aggregate demand in the economy, which would be more serious effects. Question 21. Why is the HDI a better measure of living standards than GDP per head? Okay, so again, this question is so similar to other ones. HDI accounts for real GDP per head, the average years of education, and it takes healthcare factors into consideration as well. Does not account for changes in population, does not account for output, that is just GDP, and it does not account for inflation. Okay? Remember, the three things for HDI which will help us to answer all of these questions is understanding the three components, which are healthcare, real GDP per head, and the average years of education. Now, there are some other components included in there, but when you go through the past papers, you will see from other videos that I've recorded, those three are the three main ones that are always mentioned. Okay, question 20. So, table shows possible sequences between the rate of interest and other economic variables. Which sequence is most likely? Okay. So if the interest rate is higher, borrowing decreases. We'll leave that there for the moment. That's correct. Interest rate is higher, borrowing increases. That's wrong. So we can take that out. Interest rate is lower, borrowing decreases. That's wrong. Interest rate is lower, borrowing increases. That's correct. Remember, when the interest rate is higher, it becomes harder for us to borrow money because we have to pay back more money to the bank. Now, if the interest rate is lower, it becomes easier to borrow money because we have to pay back less to the bank. So it incentivizes us to borrow. So now we need to match it up with our investment in GDP. And for these, it's going to be determined by which way AD moves, right? So these two are going to be affected by AD. Now, if the interest rate is higher and the borrowing decreases, that is a contractionary monetary policy. Okay, and that would mean that AD should move to the left. What we know about AD moving to the left is that the components of AD should decrease, so we'd expect investment to go down if we're borrowing less money, obviously. And therefore, because AD goes left, we'd expect our GDP to decrease as well. Okay, so that one is wrong. For the last one, borrowing goes up, so it's expansionary monetary policy. And just applying common sense even without knowing your monetary policies. If we're borrowing more, then obviously investment will increase. And if investment increases, investment is a component of AD here. So AD will obviously increase, which will cause our GDP to increase. Okay, question 19. Why might a government decide to subsidise a high-cost steel industry if cheaper imports of steel are improving the balance of payments? Okay, so first of all, if there has to be a problem, right? So we're looking for something that's problematic or a problem with the high-cost steel industry where they're trying to protect it. If it's something which says it's not a problem, then that's not going to be a reason why they'd subsidize it. If economic growth is increasing due to the success of other industries, again, that's not a problem. It's a good thing. And it means that they're going to focus their attention on the other industries, not on the steel industry. So it wouldn't apply anyway. If redundant steelworkers can easily be retrained, well, that means that they can just switch jobs easily, right? Which would not give us a reason to subsidize it. We're subsidizing it because what we want them to keep their jobs. So if the steel industry is high cost and they can be retrained easily and switch jobs to get new jobs very easily, then we won't need to bother subsidizing it. But if unemployment in steel producing areas is increasing, that's why we'll need to subsidize it, because we can assume they're not easily retrained, which is why we need to subsidize it to stop mass unemployment from happening. Okay, we've got imposition of a tax. Which area represents a tax paid by the consumers on the product? Okay, so just to show you, remember, full incidence of the tax is the new equilibrium down to where it hits the original supply. So it's this full area in here, right? Now the area that's paid by the consumer is the difference between the price they used to pay and the price they are now paying. So the consumer burden, we call it, when it's an indirect tax, is the price they're now paying compared to the price they used to pay, which when we know our area of incidence will be U and V. Okay, now just to show you X and Y, for example, this is still an incidence of the tax, but this is the incidence that the producer bears. So this is like the additional cost to the producer of the tax, the portion of the tax that they can't pass on to the consumer. Okay, the government increases taxation in order to fund an increase on government spending training schemes. What policy combination would this involve? Okay, so first of all, increasing taxation, that is a fiscal policy, right? So remember that a fiscal policy is taxes and government spending, right? So in this case, we know it's a fiscal policy. Increasing taxes is a contractionary fiscal policy. So it's nothing to do with monetary. And then spending on government training schemes over a long period of time, what that is going to do is it's going to increase our aggregate supply by making workers more skilled and more productive. Okay, so therefore, if our aggregate supply is going to increase, that tells us that it is a supply side policy, not a monetary policy. Monetary policy will only be designed to affect AD, just like a fiscal policy. What is most likely to cause a rise in the rate of inflation in an economy? Okay, so what we're looking for here is anything that's going to move AD to the right. So we're going to be looking for expansionary fiscal or expansionary monetary policies. Now, if we have a fall in import prices, that's going to have the opposite effect, right? We're going to expect that our AD will go left from our net exports. A fall in wage rates, again, how is that going to impact on AD? That's not going to result in AD going to the right. If we have a rise in the level of government spending, then that would be a fiscal policy, and specifically it would be an expansionary fiscal policy which is designed to move AD to the right. A rise in the level of unemployment would come about from AD moving to the left, because it would result in our real GDP going down. And we know when our real GDP goes down, our output goes down, which means that we have less being produced and we need less workers to make that also. Okay, 13, very simple, we won't spend too long on this. What is the definition of diseconomies of scale? That is the increase in average total costs as the output increases, right? So in class we described it as a firm gets bigger, their average costs go up. So it's a bad thing for the company, right? Just look at your slides on 3.5. I think it's given on, the definition of diseconomies of scale is given on slide 35 of chapter 3.5. And the only reason I know the specific slide is because at the time I'm recording this video, I literally taught that lesson yesterday. Okay, what's the main difference between capital intensive production and labor intensive production? Okay, so capital intensive is where we're using more machinery and more equipment. Labor intensive is where we're using more people, right? So therefore the market structure of the production process is not going to have an effect on whether it is capital intensive or labor intensive. Okay, the output that the production process creates, again, maybe it will have an effect, sure, yeah, because the output may need to be labor intensive or capital intensive, but it's not the main difference. The main difference is the resources they rely on, which you've just described. Capital intensive will rely on, guess what, capital, and labor intensive will rely on, guess what, labor. The other factors can affect it, but it's not the main difference. The first difference between them is in the name, which is that capital intensive uses more capital and labor intensive uses more labor. Question 9. In recent years, some central banks have reduced interest rates below 1% per year. What is the purpose of this monetary policy? So interest rates are low. We've already described what that's going to do. That's going to increase our level of borrowing, right? And it's going to increase our level of investment, because that was in one of the previous questions on this paper. So to discourage lending, no, it's going to encourage lending. So the lending or the borrowing we would expect to rise. To encourage investment, yeah, so we can see that over here from what we had known in the previous questions on the paper. Increase savings, savings will go down. And to reduce inflation, inflation will go up because it's likely to increase our AD, which makes us susceptible, or it makes it possible for demand pull inflation to be created. Okay, question 8. Why does specialization increase the productivity of workers? So we talked about this in class before. Should be very straightforward. Average cost of production increases, not true. Average cost of production comes down. Staff turnover is high. That is not a reason to explain the productivity increasing of employees, is it? If staff turnover is high, we'd expect productivity to go down. The main reason is that time is saved in between tasks, right? So we focus on what we're good at, which means we become very good at it, which means that we become more productive over time. Workers lose interest in the job. As we do the same thing, It's not a reason why it increases the productivity, but it is related to specialization, because workers becoming bored is a disadvantage of using specialization or division of labor. Question 7. A mobile cell phone operator increases the price of making calls on its network. After the price increase, the revenue of the phone operator falls. Okay, so first of all, if price goes up and total revenue goes down, that tells us that it is elastic. Okay, remember with PED, price goes up, the change in the quantity demanded will be greater than the change in price, which means that our revenue will drop. So remember, we can simplify it by saying price up equals total revenue down, price down when it's inelastic equals total revenue goes up. And when it's inelastic, they follow the same pattern. Price up, total revenue up, price down, total revenue down. And that's because the change in the quantity demanded will only be small when it's inelastic. So the change in price will have a greater effect. Whereas when it's elastic, change in price will have a smaller effect than the change in demand. So that's going to be A. Okay, difficult enough question here, but we have to remember what we see. Vertical demand tells us that it is perfectly inelastic, right? So we can change the price and the same quantity is going to be demanded. 20 people are still going to buy the product here no matter what price we change it to. It's a perfectly inelastic demand curve. Therefore, first one, price increases will raise the producer's revenue. That's true, because if we put a price here of P, 20 people will buy it. But if I increase the price by 100%, still 20 people will buy it. So increasing the price doesn't actually change the demand when it is perfectly inelastic. Producers are unable to respond to a price rise. That's nothing to do with demand, that is to do with supply, which is not referenced. Product is one with many substitutes. Absolutely not. If it's inelastic, the likelihood is that they would have no substitutes. They're more elastic the more substitutes that they have. And there's 20 people able to buy the product. That's not true. Remember, demand is the willingness and the ability to buy the product. So 20 people able would be something that we call their notional demand, the people who want to buy it. The effective demand is represented by the willingness and ability to buy it, which is shown on the demand curve, right? We might have 40 people who are willing or able to buy the product, but if it's not represented on the demand, then they're not going to be willing and able to buy it. Okay, question 5. An airline upgrades its services by providing bigger aircraft. The airline claims it will reduce catering waste and lower carbon emissions per passenger journeys, although fares may rise. What is a private cost and external benefit? Okay. Remember, external benefit is third parties who are going to benefit from this decision that was made, right? Private cost is the cost that the firm is going to incur. Okay, so this is relating to the firm specifically, this airline. What cost are they going to have to incur because of this? So the cost they're going to have to incur, higher fares is not a private cost. Less catering waste is not a cost. Lower CO2 is not a cost. Sorry. Higher fares is a cost because private cost is relating to those who were involved in the production and the consumption of whatever decision is made. So that will be the firms and the consumers as well. So the consumers will have to incur the private cost of higher fares. Now, if we look at the benefit, higher fares is definitely not a benefit, right, for third parties. People that are not involved, how do they benefit from this decision that's been made? They're going to benefit from lower CO2 emissions that are made. So B will be our correct answer here. Okay, Cuba is implementing free market reforms. What is a likely advantage of this? Greater equality, that's not true. The equality is likely to go down the more free market their economy becomes. Increased provision of public goods, that's not true. There will be no public goods in a free market. There's more likely to be more public goods in a planned economy because they're only provided by the government. And less consumption of goods with external costs, again, that's not true. The consumption of goods with external costs will increase because firms will only take into account their private costs and private benefits. They won't take into account the external costs or external benefits of producing goods. An advantage is a wider variety of goods and services will be produced. And why is that? Free markets will create more competition, and more competition creates more choice. Two, at which point will the economy show the highest potential for sustained long-run economic growth? Okay, so one thing to remember here is the more consumer goods we're producing, the higher our living standards are likely to be. Okay, but remember that in order to create or to sustain economic growth, we need to produce capital goods. Right, so we're going to be looking for, because capital goods allow us to increase our productive capability in the long run. We're not going to use A because that represents inefficiency, so in the long run that's not going to help us. So whichever point is closest to making the most capital goods, which in this case here we can see is B, that will be the one that will generate the most sustained long run economic growth. Last question. A government wishes to increase agricultural output. It gives farmers the tools to irrigate the farmers' fields. Which factors of production are provided by the farmers? So it's giving the farmers the tools to irrigate their fields. Okay, therefore what's included? Well, the land is obviously included because it's being done on the land. But the farmers are being given the tools to irrigate the fields. They are the ones that are going to do it, right? So it's the labor that's involved, not the capital. The farmers, remember, are providing the labor, and that is the question, right? Because the farmers are the labor, so that's what they provide. And we know land, because we're trying to increase agricultural output, we've got to irrigate the fields.